Welcome back to the Unit 8.9 Notes, Cold War Cuba. This is part 2. Last time we left off, we took a look at the outcome of the Bay of Pigs invasion. To kind of recap, we talked about how this U.S. invasion was a complete failure and ultimately is going to lead to the USSR getting much more involved in the relationship between Cuba and the United States. Let's jump to the next slide and find out how and why missiles were placed in Cuba. As a reminder, while you're watching this lecture video, you want to be filling in the blanks of your notes, completing the prediction questions, completing some check for understanding show you rock questions, and also visiting the appropriate video links up on the board in order to get a better understanding of the content. So missiles in Cuba. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, Khrushchev decides he needs to get more involved in the relationship between the U.S. and Cuba. And one of the things he does to get more involved in this relationship is he decides to send Soviet missiles and put these Soviet missiles in Cuba. These Soviet missiles would be aimed at, you guessed it, the United States. Now, why were these Soviet missiles placed in Cuba? Well, the first one was to protect Castro. The Soviet Union could not afford for Castro to be assassinated or overthrown. They could not afford for Cuba to become a capitalist country. And so these missiles were there to kind of stop the United States from any future attack or any future plans to make Cuba capitalist. The second reason that these missiles were placed there was for revenge. If we fast forward back to the beginning of our Cold War unit, we remember that the United States was practicing something called containment. The strategy and foreign policy of trying to keep communism contained and not allowing it to spread. Now, during that containment strategy, the United States came up with the Marshall Plan and Truman Doctrine. We know that the Truman Doctrine was the idea and goal of helping Greece and Turkey fight off communism by providing them with various types of aid. During this Truman Doctrine containment phase, when the United States was providing Greece and Turkey with this aid, the United States placed missiles in Turkey. Now, if we take a look at our map, we can see Turkey is located here, and we can see how close the Soviet Union and Turkey are. So, as you've already guessed it, the United States placed these missiles in Turkey, faced them towards the Soviet Union as a way to hopefully control the Soviets during the Cold War era. Something that's going to be really important to keep in mind is that only the United States and Turkey knew about these missiles that were in Turkey. That's going to be a really important detail to remember because when this Cold War Cuba conflict ends, again, only the United States and the USSR know about those Turkish missiles. That little secret is going to give the United States a bit of an advantage once this Cuban crisis ends. But we'll come back to that at the end of lecture. Now, the United States was easily able to find that the Soviet Union had placed missiles in Cuba. American planes were flying over Cuba consistently, and it's these planes that were able to detect that something was being built on Cuba. Photographs taken from above the air were able to capture these missiles and these missile launch pads in Cuba and send that information back to the American government, who quickly realized we have a huge problem on our hands that needs to be handled. If we take a look at this map, we can see on this map 4 launch sites in Cuba that were created with the help of the USSR. We can also see these missiles which are standing here, these missile pads, ready to launch missiles over into the United States. These arrows down here are showing you the paths taken by those Cuban exiles when they launched that failed Bay of Pigs invasion. This map does a really nice job of showing you where exactly these Soviet missiles in Cuba were prepared to launch to. We can see major American cities like New York, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Chicago, Denver, Seattle, Los Angeles, and also a strategic location in Mexico City itself. When the United States gained this intelligence of the capacity of these missiles to strike these very important American cities, America stepped into action. Before we move forward, go ahead and pause your video. Complete these check for understanding show you rock questions. Once you're done answering these questions, go ahead and resume your video. We will not be going over the answers for these questions, but you can check your answers by coming into office hours or by replaying this video. All right, now that you checked your understanding, let's stop and make some predictions. Go ahead and independently complete sentence starters 1 and 2 before moving on to the next slide. Pause this video and go ahead and resume once you're ready. All right, so let's see if your predictions are accurate. Now, we talked about missiles being placed in Cuba and the United States being aware of these missiles. When the United States becomes aware of these missiles, that is when the Cuban Missile Crisis actually starts. Make sure that you fill in the blank on the title of your notes slide. So Kennedy, the U.S. president, we can see him here. Kennedy, the U.S. president, announces that the United States will see any missiles launched by the communist leader Fidel Castro in Cuba. He'll see any missiles launched by Fidel as a direct fault of the Soviet Union. So we can see our Soviet Union leader in the middle, Khrushchev. The U.S. decides that making these announcements of blame, stating that it will blame the USSR for Cuba's actions, that these announcements are not enough. They need to take some type of physical action. And that action is the United States decides to launch a naval quarantine. If we take a look at our map down here at the bottom, we can see these green dots that are located all the way around Cuba, as well as the Dominican Republic and Haiti. These green dots represent ships. American ships which were sent over to basically create a blockade all around Cuba. The goal of this blockade was to not allow any more missiles to get into Cuba. Now, this blockade is similar but also different from the trade embargo that we talked about earlier. The blockade and trade embargo are both ways of the United States trying to control this Cold War problem in Cuba. But the big difference is the naval blockade was actual physical American sailors and personnel and actual physical American ships physically blocking Cuba. The trade embargo was basically just an announcement, letting other countries know, if you are our capitalist ally, we, the United States, do not want you trading with Cuba, and we, the United States, will not trade with Cuba. So the trade embargo isn't any physical blockade, it's more of an announcement, whereas this blockade, this quarantine, this naval quarantine, this is an actual physical blockade. The USSR is outraged by this blockade. How dare the United States blockade their communist ally? And so the USSR states that it will be sending Soviet ships, armed Soviet ships, down to Cuba to meet this blockade and, if necessary, break up this American blockade. This is the closest during the Cold War that the US and the Soviet Union comes to actual face-to-face combat. There's been other issues. We learned about Germany, Vietnam, Korea, arms race, space race, China, and some other places. But this is the first time during the Cold War where it seems that American military force and personnel are going to come into combat with USSR military force and personnel. Huge problem. Go ahead and pause this lecture video. Go ahead and check the link up on the whiteboard for your YouTube video. Watch the YouTube video on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Make sure that you jot down 3 key takeaways and then come back and restart your lecture. All right, so now that you've seen this video, let's talk about the ending of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, both countries, the U.S. and USSR, were practicing something called brinksmanship. And if we take a look at this picture in the upper right-hand corner, this does a nice job of showing what brinksmanship means. Brinksmanship is when you push a dangerous event to the highest limits possible in order to try to get an advantage. So if we take a look at this lady, she's standing on a really high pillar, but she's sticking out her foot to kind of test the limit and see how far off the edge can I get without falling off. The US and USSR are doing the same thing here, but the big difference is they're pushing the limit by seeing which one of us can be the most aggressive without backing down. Now, we know that the United States has this naval blockade all around Cuba, and we know that the Soviet Union is coming down with its own ships to meet this blockade. Both of these countries have stated they will not move. They're both practicing brinksmanship. They're both seeing if the other one will give up first. Who do you think is going to give up? Or will anyone give up? Let's find out. The USSR decides to call off its ships and turn its ships back to the USSR in order to not meet the US quarantine. Now, because of this decision, nuclear war, World War III, has literally just been avoided. If the USSR had not backed down and had met this US blockade, history would have played out very differently. We may or may not be here today if the USSR had not turned around. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest during the Cold War that the US and USSR ever got to directly fighting each other. And after this Cuban Missile Crisis, they're actually going to kind of try to smooth out their relation a little bit, kind of try to get on better terms, even though they're still fighting over ideologies. After this Cuban Missile Crisis, they're going to kind of like, whew, that was close. And they're going to try to kind of smooth out this like tense relationship. They're still going to have tension, but they're going to try to avoid that tension that they got to during the Cuban issue. They will never come this close again, as mentioned. So what happens after the Cuban Missile Crisis? What does post-Cuba look like during the Cold War era? Now, if you remember, the Cold War is from 1945 to 1991, and the Cuban Missile Crisis happens during this Cold War period. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War will continue. So let's take a look at what happens in Cuba after this missile crisis, but during the Cold War period. The Soviet Union agrees to not place any more missiles in Cuba. They also agreed to move the current missiles that were in Cuba. Now, Cuba was furious. Obviously, the United States is happy. Soviet Union is not going to send any more missiles. Soviet Union is going to remove the current missiles. But Cuba's furious. It's furious that its communist ally has, in a sense, kind of like backstabbed and abandoned it. Cuba, as a result, will kind of alienate and distance itself from the USSR. Now, because the Soviet Union took out the Turkish missiles and promised not to send any more missiles, the United States decided to kind of also cooperate. And so the United States decided to go back to Turkey and to take out those secretive missiles that had been placed in Turkey. Now, if we remember, only the United States and only the Soviet Union knew about those Turkish missiles. And so the world had no idea that the United States took missiles out. Since the world only saw USSR take missiles out of Cuba, they only saw the USSR back out and turn away from the blockade, they only heard that the Soviet Union would no longer send missiles, it pretty much looked like the Soviet Union was giving a lot to the US and the US was not having to give anything to the Soviet Union. And so a lot of people will feel that the Soviet Union lost the Cuban issue in the Cold War era. I'll leave it up to you to decide based on the facts. Now, the tension between the USSR and United States remained after the Cuban Missile Crisis, like I mentioned earlier, because after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War will still be going on. Go ahead and pause this lecture, watch the video for YouTube provided to you at the whiteboard, and jot down some 3 key takeaways on the death of Fidel Castro. Once you've completed that video, you are now done with this entire lecture on Unit 8.9 Cold War Cuba, and you can go ahead and move into your exit ticket. I hope you enjoyed this recorded lecture. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to let me know and reach out to me. Have a good one.